George Washington, the first president of the United States, died on December 14, 1799. While the nation mourned, one doctor refused to accept and concocted a plan to bring George Washington back to life.
Give my creation life!
So, today we're going to take a look at how one doctor tried to resurrect George Washington from the dead. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. And after that, leave us a comment below and let us know what other pseudo-scientific topics you would like to hear about. Okay, sometimes
that is better.
On December 13, 1799, George Washington rode his horse through icy rain, snow, and hail. Washington hated being late and was rushing home for dinner, so he didn't even stop to change out of his damp clothes. Washington may have made it to the table on time, but he paid a high price for his punctuality. Later that night, the former president woke up clutching his chest, unable to breathe. His wife, Martha, frantically called for help, and Washington's chief aide, Colonel Tobias Lear, rushed to find a physician. Two men, Dr. James Craik, who had treated Washington for over 4 decades, and George Rawlins, an expert in the art of bloodletting, answered the call. Both came to the house and treated the ailing president throughout the night. Colonel Lear, for his part, gave Washington a tonic made from molasses, butter, and vinegar. If you're wondering how that delicious colonial Robitussin helped the situation, it didn't. In fact, it nearly choked the president. Every few hours, Rawlins would remove blood to cool the president's fever. By dusk on December 14th, Rawlins, apparently trying to earn his way into vampirehood, had taken out nearly 40% of the blood in Washington. It was all for naught. George Washington died just after 10 p.m. on December 14, 1799, from a combination of a viral infection and the bloodletting treatments. Dr. William Thornton rushed to Mount Vernon to try to save the president's life. A specialist in performing tracheostomies, which were dangerous surgical procedures in the 18th century, Thornton was confident he could relieve Washington's suffering. But by the time Thornton arrived, it was too late. Washington was already gone. Thornton described the scene 20 years later. He said he saw Washington laid out a stiffened corpse and that he was overwhelmed with the loss of his best friend. For most people, seeing the lifeless body of their best friend would be cause for sadness and mourning. But Dr. Thornton wasn't most people, and he wasn't quite prepared to surrender this eternal chess match to the Grim Reaper just yet. Filled with bravado, Thornton believed that he could bring Washington back to life. Thornton wasn't just an expert in tracheostomies. He had also read about the history of blood transfusions in the 17th century. These experiments were deemed so dangerous that the procedure was banned in France, but Thornton still believed it might work. The word crazy gets thrown around a lot these days. It is difficult to hear about a doctor who thinks he can bring people back from the dead without thinking about a mad scientist like Victor Frankenstein. But William Thornton wasn't a mad scientist. In fact, he was a mad doctor, educated at Europe's best medical schools. And he was known for using cutting-edge medical techniques in 1799. Thornton was born in 1759 in the West Indies, but he grew up in England. He went on to train as a physician in Scotland and France before moving to the United States and becoming a U.S. citizen. In addition to his training as a physician, Dr. Thornton was an amateur architect. In fact, Thornton is best known as the first architect because he successfully won the competition to design the U.S. Capitol building. Washington himself gave Thornton this honor in 1793. Thornton's payment was $500, the equivalent of about $15,000 in 2021. He also received a building lot in Washington, D.C., and a friendship with America's first president. Now, before we go on, let's go back to 1492. 1492 was a big year for several reasons. Obviously, there's the whole Christopher Columbus becoming the first European to reach the Americas thing. But there was also the very first known attempt at a blood transfusion. It occurred when Pope Innocent VIII fell into a coma. His physician recommended blood and hired 3 young boys to donate blood to the Pope. The technology to inject blood intravenously didn't exist. So, according to one account, the physician poured blood into the Pope's mouth. To state what is obvious now, it didn't work. The Pope died, and so did all 3 boys. So much for do no harm, Doc. However, the groundbreaking medical work of William Harvey in the 1620s would bring moving blood back into the spotlight. Harvey demonstrated that blood circulated through the body, meaning that it was possible to insert new blood into someone's veins. By the 17th century, scientists had also designed metal tools that could inject blood into the veins. This combination of technology and scientific theory set off a wave of blood experiments. Scientists in London's Royal Society were the first to test Harvey's hypothesis. Rather than attempting a transfusion between humans, they experimented on animals. In 1656, Christopher Wren, famous for designing St. Paul's Cathedral in London, tested William Harvey's theory by injecting wine and ale into the veins of a dog. Not surprisingly, the dog got drunk. Wren's experiment proved the veins transmitted the alcohol throughout the dog's body. One of Wren's colleagues at Oxford, a physician named Richard Lear, then tried to inject other substances into a dog's veins, including warm milk and broth. These experiments were less successful, but they led Lear to wonder if it was possible to swap blood between two dogs. If blood was nourishing, could it be transferred? In 1665, Lear successfully transfused blood from one dog into another. Scientists across Europe then began experiments of moving blood from one animal into another. But these scientists wondered if transfusion would alter the recipient. Robert Boyle, famous for his work on gases, wrote a list of questions on transfusion. He wondered things like whether a fierce dog infused with blood from a cowardly dog would become more tame, or whether a transfusion from a poodle would cause a straight-haired dog's fur to curl. Scientists also wondered if it was ever safe to give a human a blood transfusion. If the blood and the soul were connected, a blood transfusion might threaten someone's very soul. Finally, on June 15, 1667, a French doctor, Jean-Baptiste Denys, put all these questions to rest by performing the very first successful human blood transfusion. Jean-Baptiste Denys was already an expert in animal transfusions. He performed public transfusions on the banks of the Seine River in Paris to prove that circulation was real. Ah, Paris. Denys invited gentlemen, noble women, and commoners as he transfused blood between dogs in front of a live audience. Denys ruled out using human blood, declaring it barbarous to shorten the life of one man to extend the life of another. Instead, he decided to use animal blood, reasoning that animal blood had fewer impurities than human blood because animals didn't drink or swear. In June of 1667, Denys gave lamb's blood to a 16-year-old who suffered from fevers. The physician declared the boy cured. Then Denys transfused a butcher with lamb's blood. After the procedure, the butcher was in a cheerful mood and he butchered the lamb on the examination table and took it home for dinner. That's one way to show gratitude. Denys' successful human blood transfusion set off a race for other countries to perform their own transfusions. In November of 1667, the English scientists of the Royal Society planned their own human-animal transfusion. As a subject, they chose Arthur Koga, a Cambridge-educated man who was mentally unstable. He spoke only Latin, and physicians said his brain was a little too warm. The English scientists hoped the transfusion would cure Koga of his mental illness, thus proving their transfusion was better than the French method. Under Richard Lear's direction, a large audience gathered to watch Koga's transfusion. Lear successfully transfused lamb's blood into Koga, and a month later, Koga returned for a second transfusion. However, when the Royal Society scientists wanted to perform a third transfusion, Koga refused. He declared that the transfusions had turned him into a sheep and began writing under the name Koga the Sheep. So if you're keeping notes at home, they either completely failed to cure his mental illness or turned him into a were-sheep. So the whole turning a man into a sheep thing wasn't the victory they hoped it would be. But the biggest setback in the science of blood transfusions really came in 1667 with the murder of Antoine Mauroy. In Paris, Denys tried to cure Mauroy with calf blood, but during his third transfusion, Mauroy began having seizures and died. Denys was thereafter charged with the murder of Mauroy, and the trial was nothing short of chaotic. A neighbor claimed that Mauroy's wife, Perrine, had murdered him, and police found mysterious, deadly powders in her house. Another neighbor said a mysterious physician had offered him money if he'd testify that Moroi died during the transfusion. As a background, you should understand that many physicians were outright opposed to transfusion. One of them was a former pirate ship doctor named Henri-Martin de la Martinière, who argued that blood transfusions would lead to the kidnapping of children and cannibalism, which sounded reasonable at the time. Anyway, Martinière wrote to Denys saying, "Allow me to tell you, sir, that Satan reveals himself through your work." Martinière even personally knew Perrine Moroi and told her to blame Denys for Antoine's death. Like we said, it was chaotic. In the end, Denys was found not guilty, but blood transfusion was banned in France as an unsafe procedure. So finally, this long and sordid road of human-animal blood transfusions, were-sheep transformations, and murder trials brings us back to December 15th, 1799, when William Thornton looked at the frozen and lifeless body of George Washington. Thornton believed he could revive Washington, even after rigor mortis had set in, by combining heat, air, and blood. Just like the movie Flatliners, with Thornton acting like Kiefer Sutherland, he called for cold water to slowly warm the president's body. He then planned to wrap the body in blankets, and by degrees and by friction to give him warmth. Thornton believed this would revive the president's cold blood vessels. After warming the body, Thornton would perform a tracheostomy. This procedure was quite risky in the 18th century, since sterilization and antibiotics were still a long way off. But it would carry less risk when performed on someone who wasn't alive. Thornton would inflate George Washington's lungs with air, artificially replicating respiration. Then he would use lamb's blood to provide the vital energy to spark the president's life force. Thornton, who had no doubt read about Arthur Koga's transfusion in the Journal of the Royal Society, believed that if madness could be cured, so could reanimating a human. He may miss the part where Koga thought he turned into a sheep. In the end, Thornton's plan to resurrect the president was quickly stopped, being overruled by Washington's family. Rather than arguing with Thornton about whether it was possible to bring the president back, they claimed it was better to leave the president's legacy intact, as one who had departed full of honor and renown, free from the frailties of age, in full enjoyment of every faculty, and prepared for eternity. In short, death was better than a George Frankenstein president resurrected with lamb's blood. Thornton disagreed. Even 2 decades later, he wrote, "There was no doubt in my mind that his restoration was possible. As the great one Wayne Gretzky once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take." So what do you think? Which would have been better, President George Washington or reanimated George Washington? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.